Well, let's first speak to Lord Malloch-Brown, former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Mark, good evening and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Henry.
Hi.
Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. The Prime Minister promised these missiles during a visit by President Zelensky. You remember he came here in February, and at the Munich Security Conference, which I'm not sure if you attended this year, but
Yes.
he reiterated this pledge, saying Kiev needed protection from, quotes, Russian bombs and Iranian drones. I'm just wondering what you make of this delivery, the fact that it's actually happened.
Well, look, I mean, it's a great, President Zelensky's trip has paid for itself in that sense.
Yeah.
Um, it's a great payback on his speech to Parliament. You'll remember the government felt very pressed at the time, reluctant to be seen as dragging its feet with this extraordinary figure in front of them addressing the British Parliament and really sort of whipping up a storm of support. So, it was, I think, always going to come. And the one thing about Rishi Sunak, unlike his immediate predecessors, is if he promises something, he generally tries to deliver. And so, I think this was long anticipated that it would happen. I think it comes with conditions around the use of these weapons to, in a sense, offer the Ukrainians the chance to protect their own aircraft by not having them to fly them too close to the target, but where the targets are expected to remain in Ukrainian territory, that you aren't going to get deep penetration into Russia, which might well risk widening the war. But look, the Russians feel provoked and have made some aggressive statements in response, even if they're not surprised by the decision.
Yeah. How seriously should the British government take those threats? I mean, some people have got very excited about it on social media, but at the level of government, the level of Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, how should they read this?
I think it's very important that it's read as just an obvious, logical next step in providing the weapons that Ukraine needs for its own defense, and to not get engaged in either speculation or rhetoric which might widen the war. I mean, obviously, the extreme risk is that the Russians, who have, are thought to have, positioned some sort of explosive ordnance around optic fibers leading into the UK through the North Sea, etc., that these might somehow be tampered with or blown up. That would really risk internationalizing this conflict. And I think it's not how the Russians are likely to react. They're struggling enough on the Ukraine front. The last thing they need to do is widen the war in a way which would bring in the whole of NATO. But equally, people need to keep their rhetoric calm. And I would say, this is the same day where the US has accused South Africa of providing arms covertly to Russia. So, in general, there is a risk of this starting to escalate. There was always the risk of this as more countries got drawn in. So, it's a time for cool heads.
Yeah, it underlines the need for the kind of expertise you're famous for, diplomacy. And when we marked the first anniversary of the war in February, there was a lot more energy. There were votes in the UN, and people were saying we must renew a diplomatic push. But it's all gone quiet, hasn't it? How disturbed are you by that?
Well, look, I mean, I think it's gone quiet, but actually, there's going to be an economic reconstruction conference in June in London. I think the NATO support remains solid at this time, but a lot hinges on this Ukraine spring offensive. If it doesn't generate a breakthrough of some kind, which puts pressure on the Putin regime to come to the table and negotiate peace, we are in a new world, because at that point, both sides will have kind of exhausted their offensive capability, and it will sort of create a moment of either exhausted stalemate or one where both sides reflect on the fact that they're not going to win on the battlefield and it would be better to come together. So I think there's a lot resting on this offensive, and, military experts are very mixed about its prospects, with some feeling that at best Ukraine will only secure limited gains, others thinking it might lead to a Ukrainian breakthrough which would directly threaten Russia's hold on Crimea. Um, you know, these are very different options. But if the more optimistic are not met, then I think it is going to create a moment at which not just Europe but the US are going to be thinking, just how long is this going on? And the Russians will be saying, well, maybe let's extend it. Is there a prospect that President Trump is going to get reelected? The same President Trump who on CNN last night said, I'd end this war in a day if I was
Yes.
back. He wouldn't end it on Ukraine's terms. He made that clear in the interview.
Yeah, I did notice that, and we will talk about that with an American commentator in about an hour's time. But when it comes to President Putin, you'll have seen him on Victory Day um, making a speech, trying to show strength, project power, talking about the West and Nazism. What did you make of that?
Well, what was very striking about it was the limited number of soldiers and weapons that were deployed. One rather lonely World War II tank, uh, and at one level, you could say this was an austerity victory parade because the boys were over fighting, and that this was the right tone to set. But I think a more plausible explanation is that he was very worried of a backlash if there was anything like a celebratory mood, which the parents of those who've either lost their lives on the Ukraine front or are currently fighting there would have taken extreme objection to and even come out and demonstrated against. Putin's in a very fragile place. He's frankly losing the war in terms of his original war aims, uh, yet he can't find a way to go back because of the state of Russian public opinion, which in many ways is in a highly nationalist moment still, and wanting a victory he can't deliver. And if instead he delivers a peace which falls well short of his war aims, or is caught in a stalemate he can't break out of, his problem may be less a military offensive from Kiev and more the domestic backlash at home.
Let's wait and see. Thank you very much indeed for your analysis, Lord Malloch-Brown, former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations.